We just got back to the donut garage. Got the motor back from Edelbrock. So the plan for today is to get all of these fresh parts, put on the new motor, ready to drop in by the end of the day. But let's take a closer look at what we have ready for this swap. So I'm going to show you how I would go about doing a swap. I have everything laid out on the ground. I have all the parts ready to go. And I have all my tools ready to go for the day. But along with all the parts, I have every bag labeled, ready to go for, say, the throttle bodies. Those bolts are ready to go. And, you know, engine mounts, coil packs, stuff like that. If I were to draw this out on cardboard in a row with all these 8 bolts, then each one I pull out, I know exactly where I've left off in the sequence of the torque. And I write the torque down next to each bolt, just so I remember what they are. And it's just good to have spread out on a big sheet of cardboard in case you are forgetful sometimes like me, and you can pick up right where you left off. So first I'm going to start with the valve covers. Transforming from an LS1 to an LS3, so we had to get LS3 valve covers in order to fit the rockers. Valve covers are on. Next I want to move to the intake manifold. I have everything we need to seal up the top end of the motor. I have the injectors, the fuel rails, the intake manifolds, and the throttle bodies all laid out so everything goes smoothly. So now that we have new heads, a new cam, it's got more air, this thing doesn't breathe, this is the old intake from the Camaro, just not going to work for us. So right away you can see the difference between the factory manifold and the Edelbrock manifold it's being replaced with. We want longer and wider runners to produce more torque and more high-end rev, and that's what we're getting with this Edelbrock manifold because the runners are longer and they're also a bit wider on the inside. We have 2 throttle bodies instead of 1 throttle body to allow more airflow for the bigger cam and the bigger heads. The factory fuel rail location is on top. On this Edelbrock manifold, it runs underneath, so we're not going to see any of that. I want to put the injectors and fuel rails on underneath, and then I'll be able to install the intake manifold all as one piece. So first thing you want to do is grab your injectors and throw them in their ports. And I use some kind of lubricant. Today using WD-40. You can use petroleum jelly, just something to lubricate it so it doesn't destroy the O-ring while going in. So one thing to note is that you have very clean surfaces. Everything I've kind of pre-cleaned with the like brake clean and a cloth just to wipe everything down, and then pre-installed these gaskets ready to go. It's kind of the final piece. Also wrote out a torque sequence so I don't forget, just 1, 2, 3, 4, stuff like that. So I just keep that on hand, put it right next to me. So a few things to note about putting on an intake manifold is that both of these are cast heads. So you have steel bolts and cast heads. So everything I do, I put in all the way down by hand, so you're not going to risk stripping it. And then you have a torque sequence to ensure that all the runners are tightened down evenly and nothing is going to have a gap. If you have a big intake manifold leak, you won't be able to source it too easily because it's underneath everything else. All right, now that these are all on, ready to go, I'm going to move to the accessories. We had kind of a change. We moved the crank pulley to a truck crank pulley to move everything out. And it's also going to space out the water pump and the power steering, just to eliminate some of the stuff that we don't need as far as like air conditioning stuff and all that junk we don't need. So all that's going away, and we're just gonna have an alternator and power steering and a really simple belt. It's gonna be all up on top and easy to work on. So I'm gonna get started on that now. All right, so the first part of this process is to put on the water pump. The new pulley basically spaces everything out. You have these spacers on the water pump right here. That's gonna make everything easier to work on for us. So this is also part of the relocation kit that has to go on with the water pump because it replaces 2 of the factory bolts. And this is to relocate the alternator bracket. So this goes on with the water pump first. Now the next step will be putting the power steering pump on, which has a brace to space everything out. All right, well, the front end is all assembled, ready to go. I'm gonna put the coil packs on, and they're relocated from the factory spot, which is right here on the valve covers. And now they're moved up to this intake manifold, which makes them out of the way, easily accessible, and kind of away from the heat, which is good for coil packs. You want a good spark. And the last thing I want to do before I put the clutch and trans on is just throw the motor mounts on real quick and the spark plugs just to seal that gap. So with this all being done now, before I put the clutch and transmission on, I'll go back over what I did. I put the intake manifold on, then we did kind of a dress up kit to eliminate some stuff up here. So relocated the power steering. The alternator, which was down here before, has now been moved up here. And we've eliminated some of the extra pulleys and air conditioning stuff we don't need with a new water pump from Edelbrock and a spacer kit as well, using a truck pulley to bring the crank pulley out even further to align all of this for the belt, which will come on. So next, gonna throw on the trans. Well, first put the flywheel, clutch, pressure plate, and then the trans. In that order, and then everything should be ready to drop in. First thing, make sure everything's very clean, there's no debris. You want to make sure that all the threads are clear and that this is all straightforward and ready to go. Now I've already put a new pilot bearing in there. That's been pressed in, and then I've also put a new slave cylinder and throwout bearing in the transmission. That's ready to go. Well, I'd advise doing that on any new clutch just because you're already there and it's kind of a pain to remove. So you might as well do it while everything's open. I'm gonna get started on putting the new flywheel in. All right, so I kind of have this secure over the crankshaft with the holes lined up, but real quick, I'll give you a tip, something to help you if you have no friends like me. This requires quite a bit of torque. I believe it's something like 85 foot-pounds, which means that's gonna spin the crank. So what I've done to remedy that without the crank spinning is just get the appropriate size socket, which is a 24mm socket, and a big breaker bar, and rest that against the ground. Now these bolts, brand new for the flywheel, they're kind of a stretch to fit in most applications, so you don't really want to reuse them. So I always get brand new ones whenever I do a flywheel or pressure plate. This calls for blue Loctite 242, and I'm going to tighten this down, torque this in a sequence, basically a star pattern, just how you do a wheel. So this is one of the more difficult parts to do by yourself. Got to make sure that the clutch and alignment tool is perfectly straight in there to keep the disc in location so you can put the input shaft in easily. If it's off a little bit, it's going to make it really hard to do. So you want to make sure that this is really well in there while you're kind of torquing this down. And these also go in a sequence, which is opposite like a crisscross pattern, but you kind of do a trailing. Since there's 6 of them, you do one across from the other and then do the trailing one of each. Flywheel, clutch, everything's installed. The next part you can do by yourself, it's just a mess, and you can see his feet in the frame. And I got my friend Jamie here, he's gonna help me do this. We're just gonna stab this thing on real quick. Slide it on. That's it, everything's bolted up, ready to go. It's an assembled engine. Next step will be to prep the engine bay a little bit, make sure everything's gonna go in smoothly. And this will drop straight in, and then from there we'll put the headers on because it's kind of a tight fit to put on beforehand. So we'll put those on afterwards. As for the day, I think safe to call it done. All right, so it's a new day. We've got the engine all prepped, ready to go in the car. And I've also prepped the engine bay. And what I've done to prep the engine bay is remove some of the other lines, like the fuel lines we're not gonna use, and the power steering lines, which we're gonna replace to adapt to the new LS engine. And then I've put the new mounts in, so it's easy to just throw in and set right on, and remove the steering shaft. And then these bolts up here to allow the core support to come off so the engine would just go right in. We've also cut off the ABS bracket, which is intrusive and kind of in the way for the headers, to clear that, and just hammered this out just a little bit, just for some extra clearance. And I don't think that's really necessary, but it's just kind of nice. So today we're gonna drop the engine in and then put the headers on and try and mock up maybe the drive shaft and see how far we can get. All right, so we got the motor in pretty easily. It went in a lot easier than when we originally test fit it. I really like the way it sits. We don't have the trans mount in yet, but we are gonna put the headers on and just see how they fit. And if the clearance is all good, we'll continue on. So we got the motor and trans in, assembled, ready to go, and we're waiting to get the drive shaft. So brought my friend Nick in. What's going on? Say hi to everybody.
How you doing?
So I'm gonna jack this up, put the trans jack in. All right, so that's basically where it's gonna sit. This is all we have.
This is a
T56. Yeah, it's out of a Camaro. He's already prepared. That would be it.
So that one will work. We're just gonna do one piece all the way straight back, get rid of this hanger bearing and everything here.
Yeah. Now the only problem I see is we're gonna have a fuel cell right here, the fuel tank, but it should go no higher. I think this would be the lowest point right here.
So if we do like a center line, just kind of get
I'll hold that for you.
an idea. You think that's gonna clear? Your drive shaft's gonna be another inch on each side of this tape measure, probably a 3-inch diameter
3-inch
shaft.
diameter?
Yeah. That gonna clear your fuel tank up the top?
It should clear the fuel tank. I'm not worried about that.
Okay.
So that's all you need here is to measure from this flange?
Yeah, so we're gonna go from the flange here to the center of the U-joint on the front.
How do you feel about the angle of this though? With the, is there any problem with how this is aligned?
No, angle-wise it doesn't look too bad. We don't usually advise on angles per se, but
yeah.
You know, again, just going from the tranny to the diff, it looks pretty good. It's coming down just a little bit. We want at least 1 degree of working angle for the U-joints. You know, no more than 3 usually.
I got you.
And so that looks like it'll fit, you know, right nicely.
And you're just measuring to this point of the flange here?
I'm just running the center line right there. When we take our measurement, we go to the center of the cap in
directly
the U-joint.
in the cap?
Yeah, so we'd go right to the center.
All right.
Some shops might do it a little differently. We collapse everything all the way to make sure that the yoke goes all the way in, and then build it from there.
Perfect. Thanks a lot, man.
Sure thing.
All right, so the headers are all installed. It went pretty easily. They fit really nicely. There's good clearance. And that leaves me with one step to put in this collapsible steering shaft, which I had to replace because the factory one does not work. It's really tight down in here. If you can get a closer look, it has to go in between the headers here. So this makes it really clever. So I'm gonna show you a closer comparison between this and the factory piece and why we need this. All right, so here I have the factory BMW steering shaft, and it's aluminum, it's lightweight, it's kind of nice, but it's very bulky and it does not collapse. So I can't get it in between the headers, and that's a big problem. So we got this from Flaming River, and it's actually part of the kit that you get with Pushrod for the swap kit, and it's collapsible. So when it's all the way out, it'll be the length that this is, but to get it into the car between the headers, you collapse it all the way down so you can actually fit it through the header and then slide it back on. And you have this solid steering shaft, which is much nicer than this rubber joint that tends to go bad. This little guibo, it's just a problem. So even though the headers are on, we're not gonna install this part yet because there's still a few things we have to do. I want to get the suspension and stuff ready and aligned so we can center the steering rack before we put the steering shaft actually in place. So next time we have to finish up the driveline, put the rear end in. I don't know anything about it, so I'm not going to do it. We're going to call Wave Track in, and they're going to do the differential. But while they're doing that, I'm going to put in all the suspension bushings and put some new coilovers on it and get the suspension dialed ready to go. We got some driving to do this weekend. You're driving, right?
Yeah,
FC?
I'm driving Super D this weekend. You're driving this weekend?
I'm trying to steal somebody's car.
You can drive my car.
I'll borrow your car.